So let's talk about the Dingo Scout car then. This particular model, my one I'm standing in front of now, is a Mark III, made in 1945. But the Scout car story starts back in the 1930s when Britain is facing up to having to rearm. We've done all the experiments, the British Army at the end of the 1920s, testing the idea of what a mechanised force might be made up of, how it might be used in these famous exercises on Salisbury Plain. But the problem, 1930, the Great Depression, there is just simply not enough money to follow through on some of those ideas, even though the General Staff, the British High Command, as it were, are happy to see that develop. Britain, 1930s, Neville Chamberlain, first of all, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then Prime Minister, followed by Winston Churchill in May of 1940, all follow the idea that for Britain, being an island, the primary concern is the Royal Air Force to defend the skies and the Navy to defend the seas. Only if those two forces fail do we then have to really rely on our army. And up to 1939, the government of the day were desperately trying to avoid Britain getting entailed with an expeditionary force again from the army having to go across to Europe and fight. Our fingers had been burnt in the First World War. We'd lost 1 million men, even though British commanders saw that there was an inevitability that we would either have to go onto the continent again if there was going to be a major European conflict. The government was saying, no, we don't want you going there. And as I said, the priorities in terms of budgets are going to the Air Force and the Navy. Even though the Army, they've been doing these experiments, there is still that great debate going on in the 1930s where they're looking at the idea, what should be the best formation of an armoured force? Should it be leading the infantry forward? Should it be self-contained? Some in the tank corps would argue all along, saying, no, we just need a heavy tank force that will be able to do pretty much everything on the battlefield. Others quite sensibly argued, hang on, you're still going to need other services there. You're going to need your artillery. You're going to need your infantry to accompany the tanks. So that debate was almost still ongoing as Britain is starting to put together, for the first time, an armoured division. And it's also starting to put together as well the actual equipment, because we cannot prevaricate any longer. Orders are having to go in. We are having to find new factory space. As I mentioned, the priorities for the Air Force and the Navy are already there. They're the ones ahead of the queue. But that's why, for example, Britain is starting building quite so many Light 6B tanks, because it's a great introductory tank for a factory that has not made an armoured vehicle before. Cut your teeth on this. So, for example, the Vulcan works start with a Light 6B and then move on to manufacture the Matilda tank for the British military at the end of the 1930s. So what about Scout cars? So for the British, we've experimented with things like little Austin 7 cars on some of these mechanised force exercises. They're looking now for seeing the need for an armoured Scout vehicle. The cavalry has slowly been mechanised during the 1930s. They're going over to having Light 6B tanks, carrying out some of that scouting role in them, but they also realise they're going to want a wheeled Scout vehicle for doing that. And so an order in the early 1938, 3 companies are invited to tender for what is going to become called the new Scout car. Not an armoured car, because that's going to be a slightly different model in the way that Britain thinks about these things. Armoured car sent a turreted top with a gun in. The Scout car, as it says, it's going to be there. It's going to have to go along the roads. It's going to have to go cross country. So the specification says 4-wheel drive. They want some armour protection on. Later, they actually up the specification for the armour protection they're going to want there. Now, they go out to 3 British companies to do this. They go to Alvis, they go to Birmingham Small Arms, BSA, and they also go to Morris Motors. and they're basically later in 1938 come forward with your models, and they're going to be tested up at Chertsey against set criteria, which one's going to be best to then get the order to put into production. Now, as they come forward, Alvis has been a manufacturer of motor vehicles before. It tends to make mainly the chassis, the engines, the transmissions, and they're sent on to other coach building companies to finish off that way. Alvis have already put their toe in the water with Nicholas Strausler, the famous Hungarian designer that again comes up with the floating tanks in the Second World War. They've already had a go at making armoured cars for the RAF, and they've been looking for foreign markets for armoured cars. BSA, Birmingham Small Arms, again, fascinating history there. Birmingham manufacturing companies, gun makers coming together, forming Birmingham Small Arms, or as was known, BSA. Problems with these gun companies, and again, you can see why they go into other areas like motorcycles, cars, etc. One of the things BSA found was, great, look, we've got the Lee Metford or then the Lee Enfield orders coming from the British Army. But once those orders had been finished and finalised and they'd been made, what do you do with that machinery in the factory if you don't get other foreign orders, etc., to take their place? So one of the things why BSA go into bicycles and then motorcycles is because their machinery is very good at small, high-precision component parts, as are made for guns. Let's make bicycles with that machinery as well. And again, they've had a car division. They've bought Daimler Motors when they go through, like a lot of these companies, where they become parts of conglomerates and grow and expand and then contract for various reasons, economic quite often. But they're part of that Daimler motor car group, and that becomes interesting in a moment as well. The third contender in all this is Morris Motors, and Morris put forward, in fact all three of them put forward vehicles that you could argue are very, very similar. They're vehicles with the four-wheel drive that's been specified. They're vehicles with engines in the rear. They're supposed to be cross-country in their abilities, etc. Morris's, even though they do further work on it, is just not up to the specifications. Morris ends up dropping out because it's just not good enough. Alvis's vehicle is interesting, but it's a bit top-heavy and doesn't quite perform in the right way. And here's another interesting bit with the Alvis submission. They nickname it the Dingo. That's what it's going to be called there, as it's the offer is when it's going off for the Army for testing, etc. The one that shows the most promise is the Birmingham Small Arms, the BSA offer. That's the one that it's put forward in September of 38, seems to perform very well in the trials. They want a little bit more oomph from the engine. They go back and improve that. They improve the suspension slightly. And the Army also specifies 1.2 inches of armour plate. So that means upping the armour protection on the outside. But this is a vehicle that's seen with the best potential to meet that role of the new scout car that the Army wants. So they get the order. After all this testing is finished in 1938, it's basically in 1939, 172, in May of 39, 172 orders are handed to BSA. Now, BSA are basically handing that in turn to their parent or their fellow company, Daimler Motors. Now, if you think of Daimler Motors in the 1920s and 30s in particular, they are high-end, they are quality producers of cars. And that's one of the things that when you think about looking at the Dingo, that's reflected in the manufacturing quality, in the complexity, the high-end, the way it's at cutting edge in some of its technology there. And it's also from Daimler Cars issues such as using the Wilson pre-selector gearbox, the fluid flywheel. These are things that Daimler have been using on their rather advanced cars in the 30s. And also on other issues they've been building, like they've been building buses for the London Bus Corporation. Things like that, where, again, the pre-selector gearbox has been really useful there. And it was considered, the pre-selector, designed by Walter Wilson in the First World War, the famous tank designer, that was considered rather good for troops because it was considered rather easy. Now, if you've ever driven a pre-selected gearbox car or vehicle, it takes a little while getting used to. If you're used to a gearbox and a shift stick, as the Americans would call it, etc. Because what you're really doing there with Wilson Pre-Selector is you have a small lever, you put it into a numbered gear on a Dingo 1 to 5 or neutral, you put it into that, you use what we would obviously, most of us would call a clutch pedal. It's not, it's a selector pedal on a Dingo. You press that down and it will jump straight into that gear. So you can pre-select, hence the phrase, what gear you want to go in. So if you're working your way up through the gears, second, as soon as you're in second, you pre-select third, down and up on that pedal, and you will jump into that gear. And that was considered quicker to learn and simpler for a soldier than having to go through double declutching, etc., on a gearbox for a larger vehicle or the standard gearbox, to learn how to perfect that. And, 20s and 30s, there's plenty of motor cars out there, but it's still relatively new. Not everyone, as today we would assume everyone sort of has access to a family car, etc. Different story back then in the 20s and 30s. The pre-selector system, as I mentioned, it's actually connected to something called a fluid flywheel, which again in itself is quite advanced technology, something Daimler had been working with. And that in itself was complex but new. Or rather, it was something that was considered an impressive way of putting power from the engine. And the engine, they go to basically the Daimler pre-war sports car engine. They're getting a powerful 55 horsepower sports car straight six petrol engine. And it's not exactly the same as it was used in their 30s cars, but not that far off that one. That meant that this vehicle, which ends out just under about 3 tons, has a fair lick of speed. It can go about 55 miles an hour on the open road, and that was very good. The other thing Daimler comes forward is it's got a very rigid suspension in terms of, or rather I should say, very rigid chassis that is, the power is taken off to each of the 4 wheels with their own little tractor joints at each corner and their own drive shafts. And one of the things we can look at is that clever way that the drive is given to all 4 wheels, which again looks complex and was complex for a vehicle to be built in wartime, but it really does work. And they end up with solid rubber tyres, because again, if you're the scout vehicle, you can't have your tyre shot out from you. Sometimes vehicles had run flat tyres. These ones, even though they're solid rubber, the vehicle has a tremendously soft ride. It's got 8 inches of leeway when you're going over bumps, etc., with a shock absorber and coil springs there. So it gives a really good cross-country ride, even though you haven't got pneumatic tyres on there to cushion some of that sort of blow. I mentioned the Army specifies 1.2 inches on the front plate there. Daimler come up with this angled body. The angles on the metalwork are to try and help deflect bullets. And all in all, what comes together, it goes through the Mark 1, has a couple of variants on it, Mark 1A and B. Mark 2 is one, an awful lot of those ones made. Mark 3 towards the end, but those Mark 3s tend to go on in service well into the 1960s in the British forces. Some get retired off to TA units, probably serving on a fair bit longer. And also, of course, lots of other armies use the Dingo around the world when they were passed on. Over 6,000 of them made. But there were never enough Dingos in service. Again, back to when you look at it, it is a complex vehicle. And so we end up going to other manufacturers. So there's a Humber Scout car in Canada. The Lynx is made, which is basically got a Ford engine. It looks a bit Dingo-ish, but it's much cruder. It's got a more powerful engine, the Ford engine, but actually it doesn't have the sophistication of the ride, etc. So other vehicles end up being taken into service to do the scout car role because, again, this one, high-end, but never enough of them. Enormously popular and also enormously successful. That's one of the other things that we can look at with a couple of the stories of where these vehicles are being used. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But I would always go on that our fascination in the Second World War armour stories, we tend to look at the sophistication, the wow factors of German armour all over the place. Germans had nothing like this. And if they captured it, they would use a Dingo because they saw its utility and value. And again, that idea of the ultimate sort of appreciation shown by the Italians, where they've captured a Dingo in North Africa in the Second World War, they end up later on in the war putting their own version called the Linz into service. They don't make that many of them. The Germans use some of those as well. So it really is one of those vehicles that we know about it, of course. You see it in the pictures, etc. Perhaps we overlook the significance of it, what a success it was, and also in that greater scheme of thing, which we love denigrating our own products in Britain, don't we, etc. But we've got a world beater here on that. And the fact that it's not, they don't even look replacing it till 52, with the ferret, and the fact it goes on the sea service. And the ferrets almost, you could argue, has just copied many of the Dingo features. And the Dingo features, of course, lay the groundwork for the Daimler armoured car with a 2-pounder gun on. They're just looking at that. Even as they're designing this, they're thinking, hang on, this is not a bad idea. We can kind of enlarge it and make an armoured car version as well. So let's have a look at some of those features on the Dingo in a little bit more detail. I'm going to tell you a couple of the stories about where Dingos were used successfully. And I thought it'd be interesting for us to, as well, where possible, where I can do it, is show some of those things that we sometimes overlook. We said it's got a Bren gun it carries or whatever else that way. Let's have a look at some of those things that are associated with a Dingo in its wider sense. Now, although the Dingo was really meant for reconnaissance by stealth, it might have to fight for information, or inevitably, if you're the first vehicle to come across the enemy, you need some sort of weaponry to defend yourself. Now, the Bren gun is what we always tend to associate with the Dingo, fitted in the front position there. But it also had a mounting inside for the second crew member to carry a Lee Enfield rifle as well. And then, of course, there might be the personal weapons carried by the individual crew member, and there's a couple of boxes for hand grenades as well. Post-war, Dingos were fitted with smoke dischargers, which could be fired off from inside, and they were mounted on the side of the vehicle. I used to have those on. I've still got the wiring inside. I took those off because inevitably, like so many people, we really want your Dingo to look like its epitome of service, which was, for me, World War II. So for carrying normally, the Bren gun was mounted next to the petrol tank in a vertical position with a bracket and a strap that would hold it in place. And just behind the driver's and the commander's position, there's two brackets on the rear angled wall of the back of the crew cab, as it were, and that's where the Lee Enfield rifle was positioned. From the operator's position, you can see the Bren gun could be manoeuvred forward or backwards to make it comfortable for operation at the time. Extra Bren gun magazines are stowed in slots beneath the front of the armour, and hand grenades were carried in boxes at the side. For the operator who was using the Bren gun, one thing they had to be aware of, even though there is a rubber stand, mine slightly perished on this vehicle, but you have to be careful you don't place the Bren gun too far forward, or of course you'd be blocking where the empty cartridge cases of brass would be coming out from below the Bren gun when going forward. Inside the vehicle, these thick armoured housings, you can see you pull this and it releases for that thick metalwork, as we said, over an inch there, to open up for the gun port. So here on the back of the engine cover of a Dingo, there's these various welded on brackets. And what were they for? Well, I didn't know for quite some time. Then I realised it's actually for the Bren gun tripod that was carried by some vehicles, not all of them, because you won't see those on every engine cover. So those brackets on the rear here on the engine deck are actually meant for carrying the Bren gun tripod. Now that's hard to see in any of the images whether it's just a post-war addition, but the actual tripod begins early on in the Bren gun and the Dingo saga. So maybe they were just one of those things that, as I've found, are so awkward, heavy, painful. They'll pinch your skin whenever they possibly can. So perhaps they weren't really used that much. But the brackets, I'm told, is that's where your tripod would be mounted. Now, like so many Second World War vehicles, if there was a space to add an extra box, you'll see all sorts of ammunition boxes welding on at different places on, certainly on front bins on Dingos. But this particular box, if you do see this on a Dingo, it's an ammunition box for Bren gun magazines. Normally 12 magazines carried, clip there, and again, little design features, offset handles, so you can carry two of them together if you're taking them for resupply or reloading. So some of the other items you can see on the vehicle, the horn, there's a button on the dash there for operating that. You've got a butler headlight. These have two parts to them, lower half glass that you can actually bring down a shield to cover off. And that only allows you with a smaller blackout light that's above, with a shaded light, can't be seen from above. So they're on the front and they'd act as your main headlight, and there is actually, you can go full beam on those as well. Side lights, one on either side there. What else we've got? We've got a bracket here, which you can see that being used to mount sun compasses on. This one, again, shows a date there. It's actually got my old tax disc on there. Shovel, pickaxe or mattock handle. Heads of that will go into the bin on the front there as well. And on the side at the rear here, we've actually got a first aid box that was sometimes put there and sometimes here on the vehicle. Actually looking at that first aid box, pull that out. Outfit first aid for AFV's external component with a broad arrow on there. I managed to put it in the wrong way round some time ago and only just managed to force it out again, so it goes back in there like that. As I mentioned, you'll see at different times these were sometimes mounted up there, but that's where the smoke discharges went on post-war, so they've relocated it down there. This is the escape hatch. Now I've left it open so I can just about pull it open here so you can see inside there. This is if presumably only used if the vehicle's rolled. It does actually have a key to it on the outside there and somewhere where you can latch across, you know, for a padlock or something if you are securing the vehicle. But inside there's just a catch to open it, and here is where we would put the signal satchel. Now interestingly, this has actually got a spool lining. In other words, it's got a metal sheet, and the argument there was they put these metal sheets on the inside of some of this sort of port that looking out, because they were thinking that where you cut into metal, the structure of the steel plate will be more vulnerable if hit to spooling on the inside because it's weaker, it hasn't got that solid mass of it there. Hence this extra little layer of plate that's on the inside there. That's what's called a spool lining, to try and catch any bits of metalwork that might be penetrated or start flying off. But that, if I close it tightly, it will jam. Only really used, as I say, in an emergency. So here's one of these metal bins, tin work, armour plate on that side, tin work here, bolted on the rear fender, and you could put a catch or a padlock in there as well. So same on the other side. This side doesn't have this toolbox running across because of the escape hatch. And then if you look on the rear here, we've got the two fuel cans. One of the very distinctive features of the rear of a Dingo is the radiator, where the grills, the air intake there, originally the actual way the air went in was changed in terms of the direction there, but you'll see also the shape of the rear changes from the very, very first ones to this slightly angled out. And again, down the bottom there, you've got actually the position for a starting handle to turn over. So on one side, as you're facing forward, on the left side, you will actually have the escape hatch. On this side, this one's different. This is a toolbox here next to the bin that mirrors the other side as well. And then on the front, we've got quite a distinctive item. This is the jack for the Dingo, which is held in place by this bracket. It slides in here, and this one's pretty solidly. I would take it off to show you, but I'd have to use some rubber hammer an awful lot, I think, to get it out there. Now, the Mark I Dingo had a metal sliding roof. The Mark II had a roof that was in two parts that would fold over into this recess on the cab. This one, Mark II, some of them had their roofs removed. Mark III's, you just got this canvas going over the top, which is just basically really a rain shield for the crew inside. So you open both sides and then pull it forward. This, the jockey seat goes back. This one's open. This is a support bar that goes forward, and then over we go. Now this canvas roof, as you look at it, it comes all the way over, but actually there's a series here of lift the dot little catches, and if you lift these up, and they're a bit stiff with age, but underneath there's actually this part, the front part can fold back, and there is actually a little compartment there where you can put your head out, or a hole in the top, and one for the co-driver. Now, having driven in the rain in this, I can tell you now that it's pretty useless. It doesn't really stop much in the way of water coming in, and if you're going around in this vehicle in the wet, you're pretty much guaranteed to have water coming in somewhere at you, and a nice little wet crotch sort of thing as you're driving around. So yeah, it's there as a nice gesture, but it doesn't do an awful lot of good. And with the canvas move forward, this of course gives a better view of this rear hatch that the driver can open and look back through as he's reversing. So as we look across here in the driver's cab, obviously the steering wheel at a slight angle as the driver's seat is, so that again when he wants to turn around and look back in the opposite direction, it's easier for him to do so. You've got a vision block here, which, if I'm honest, I think the idea of anyone trying to look out of that, even when you had the armoured roof, admittedly over time these vision blocks, they've kind of got delaminated, they're furring up, they don't look much to look through, but even at the time with the clear one, supposedly they create the same amount of thickness and protection as the armour plate, the 1¼ inch or 1.2 inches of armour plate would have done. As you're looking, so again, as we work our way across, we have a speedo down on the bottom left-hand side. You've got a set of light switches here, a start button. Here we've got oil pressure. As you move along, you've got a charging, because again, charging in terms of the electric system is very important, because of you're going to need your batteries all the time for radio use. And on the right-hand side, we've got a temperature gauge there as well. And here, a little modification on and off, as it were, before I then compress. He says, desperately hoping I remembered to. Yeah, there you go. Starts on the button beautifully. And as we mentioned earlier, this is a pre-selector. So down here in the right-hand corner is the pre-selector gear lever. And that takes you 1, 2, 3, 4, and then T for top, all the way back down. But you only go into those gears once you have stepped down on the change pedal. I nearly said it every time. I'm about to say with the clutch one, it's not, it's a change pedal. And again, we've got the handbrake, and again in front of the handbrake is a lever. It's now in reverse. It goes reverse, neutral and forward, depending on which way. Now, moving that while the engine's running, it's like, again, another one of these peculiar things. Any Dingo driver will tell you, well, on a good day, we seem to be able to do it. It goes all the way through. On a bad day, you seem to hear gears meshing, and the first thing you're supposed to do then, turn the engine off, and then manoeuvre that lever into whether it's forward or reverse or neutral that's required. Remember, neutral always is the time. Again, if you're going to be towed, you don't want to be turning the fluid flywheel if you're going to be towed at any time. And I'll just make the point here, again, what's original, what's not. Horsehair stuffing still in that rather tatty canvas-based chair there, and I've added, I'll be honest, a cushion for the poor person who sits in the other seat here, which is there with the fire extinguisher on it, which is the twisty-turny seat, which I'll now show you actually goes up. So here we see sometimes we call it the commander's seat. Radio operator. Now he needs to get to the radio. The 19 set would be on the shelf behind him, and to be able to turn around in this very tight space, as you can see here, would be very problematic. So the chair is actually quite ingenious. At the moment his chair's in the lower position, but I'm now going to raise it up. Now I'm not sure I've actually achieved anything, but I've put the chair for you to see in the raised position, so hopefully you can see a difference there. And how far it is off the floor, and you can see there's a little hole there, and that's where this pin locates on the front if you want to secure. But otherwise, underneath, here's the lever that actually takes you up and down. The weight of you will push it back down to floor level, as it were, but it gives you better visibility and also means that the chair can swivel, which means the operator can get at that shelf that's on the back there with a bit of canvas on at the moment. Actually, that shelf is where the 19 set is, below the Lee Enfield rifle we can see there at the moment. And here behind the driver's seat and the position there is the fuel tank, filler and Kai gas primer on the back here, and below that hand throttle or choke there, to get the quite a sizable fuel tank with baffles in as well when you look down inside. I just thought I'd point out something else you'll see on a lot of the pictures with guys in World War II using goggles like these ones. This is my old pair. I replaced the elastic some time ago, and they've seen a fair old bit of use. But the idea, why do we need goggles? Well, obviously when you're driving in an open-top vehicle, things will come at you, you know, if you're a cyclist you'll know as well, whether it's flies, bees, anything that way. But again, dust thrown up from vehicles in front of you, so they were quite important. These are laminated pairs, and that's the pair I've been using a long time. I've got a spare pair there, which just showing you how they were packed, and these ones haven't been used at all, but over time what tends to happen, because they were laminated, this pair is still in pretty good order. The laminate, the balsam or the joining material starts delaminating and they'll start crazing on the inside. Again, you had other tinted glass ones, yellow tinted glass as well, but that's how they were first issued, which, sad to say, most of them over time are going to, a bit like binoculars, etc., where they'll end up quietly perishing. But that's how they were issued there in the first place, and I can't quite read. There is a stamp on the bottom of the box. But that's what the guys would be wearing in their Dingo. That's what they call the MT type or motor transport type goggles. But of course, they'd use anything they could get hold of. So famously, the Dingo carries as its main armament for most wars, or it's involved in, certainly the Second World War, the Bren gun, the British Bren gun. And in a way, that just gives us a little bit of excuse to look at this very famous British weapon. Which of course starts its life not really as a British weapon, although we always associate it for a British infantry section having a Bren gun there. Starts its life out in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. Britain, after the First World War, we've already experimented with a number of guns as potential replacements for the Lewis gun. We've got the heavy Vickers gun on the tripod, water-cooled. We want an air-cooled lighter machine gun for a section weapon. Trials in the early 20s don't really lead to anything. Early 30s, we start again. And the Czechs offer up from Brno, which is basically spelled B-R-N-O. It's a Czech weapon centre. A chap there called Václav Holek. He has been designing a light machine gun. The very first trials start early in the 1930s. It's not till 1935 that Britain finally signs a bit of paper and we build a version that we call the Bren gun. Bren, by the way, BR from Brno, EN from Enfield, joined together. And that makes the Bren gun. And that's really based on the Czech ZGB-33 weapon. Other countries also build variants of the Bren gun. And of course, it goes on. We see enormous service with British Commonwealth forces in the Second World War, goes on to serve in the British military, rechambered for NATO 7.62 round, still in service in the early 1990s in the British military. And I gather the last Bren guns were made out in India as late as 2012. So really widespread service in many different formats. You know, even the Germans, when they capture the Czech factories, they've got a version in service in World War II. Why is it good? Why does it work? Well, it's very accurate. It's very reliable. It's got this lengthy barrel. So if you think of a Lee Enfield rifle in the hands of a good marksman, you know, very accurate gun. Actually, you've got the same length barrel there. So one of the criticisms of it, maximum rate of fire about 540 rounds a minute. Not that you'd be able to fire that with these, because normally you'd have about 120 rounds a minute if you're using these magazines. The magazines will only, you're supposed to have 30 rounds in there. Soldiers are taught to only put about 28 in, so you don't jam the magazine up. So you could get round about 4 of those in a minute. Overall rate of fire, as I say, goes up to about 540 if there was a way, you know, bigger drum magazines, etc. And that's still a lot less. And when you look at things like MG34s, 42s, it sometimes, you know, sounds as a criticism against this. But that's not how the British Army want to use it. That was the Vickers doing that type of fire as well. So for here, what you're looking at is the way it was going to be used, that you were taught single shot to start with in the right circumstances. And again, you've got single automatic and safe on a button on the gun. Single shot, ranging, seeing if you're on target, then short bursts of 5 or 6 rounds. It is not, you are not there to just pump away, hoping you're getting to a target. This is a section weapon. It's to help suppress the enemy position whilst the rest of your section are advancing on them, or you're putting down the suppressing fire, etc. But very accurate from that point of view, a reliable gun, and the troops like it. There's no two ways about it. The Bren gun goes down very, very well and was a much liked weapon. Normally issued to the bigger guy in the unit because it's a blooming big lump to carry around the place. So if you watch a section of infantry, the guy who's got it over his shoulder tends to be the slightly beefier one or taller one. Normally 2 in a Bren gun section. 1 is the spotter. Number 1 in terms of numbers is actually the gunner. Number 2 is going to act as spotter and with the magazines. And of course that section, all the famous old webbing pouches that we call them Bren gun pouches, that's so they could carry the rest of the section, extra Bren gun magazines to keep this supplied. And there's one of those Bren gun chests that would normally carry about a dozen underneath the gun there, that container there. So keeping the gun supplied, very important that way. Measuring your use of ammunition, because this again, you know, if you keep on firing, that barrel's going to get hot. You have a quick release mechanism that you flip over to put a new barrel on. That's normally carried by the number 2 in the section. But if you're sensible with use, especially with the Mark II, that might not be necessary if you just keep your rate of fire to a sensible level. Mark I, this is a Mark I Bren gun. £40 when they started making them. They look to simplify it at the beginning of the war, and they knock off about 25% of the cost by simplifying it, slightly shorter, slightly lighter, easier machining processes, but trying to retain, of course, all the time the benefits of the Bren gun. And the Enfield factory that was making these, beginning of the war, they were doing about 400 a month. By the Mark II, when they've got that going, by 1943, they're coming out with 4,000 a month, because this is a much desired gun, not just being used by British, but the other Commonwealth forces, and of course dropped into France. French resistance seemed to have a love affair with the Bren gun. You know, it's a sees action in every theatre of war anywhere where British or British supplied forces are being used. Because of that, we can't make enough in the UK. Just before World War II, British government, Canadian government get together, and in Toronto they pay for a new factory in tooling that the John Inglis, INGLIS company, they make Bren guns out there as well. And really important production during the Second World War as part of that whole Canadian, you know, taking on, whether it's tank, Valentine manufacture. John Inglis makes Bren guns, but then it does a Browning high-powered pistol, it does Polston machine guns. So very, very important there, that contribution to the war effort there. This particular one, it's mounted on that tripod I was talking about that can be used in that anti-aircraft capacity. This one being used here, it's got about a 45-degree angle there around the back that you can set markers to and screw off and just have a small amount of movement there. The idea being that, again, it's not really a sustained fire role, it's more like in a prepared position role. But if, for example, smoke comes along, you've got fog or nighttime comes, and you need to know from that position you're covering off a certain point in the landscape, whether that's a road, a gap in the trees, you know, between some houses or something or other, that means you can actually lock the gun off and can fire on certain arcs if you so wish that way. As I mentioned, you do have the fittings for this tripod on the back of the Dingo. The problem you always see is no one seems to be using it. There's very few photographs with this in place, and you can't help but feel, even on the ground, you know, for infantry sections, etc., very few photographs of these being used. A few in North Africa, a couple in Italy, I think. It's just so big and heavy, even though it's beautifully made. BSA made the tripods, very nicely engineered, etc. It's very heavy. Goodness knows what it'd been like to lug one around, you know, on these carrying straps here, if you did have to carry one that way. You can see people really think it's probably too much effort for the benefits it gives, so they're, you know, returned to stores or quietly lost, I imagine, around the place. So not used in terms of that much there. So, as I say, with the Bren gun, I'm sure there was a number of Dingo crews that were very, very grateful to have a Bren with them at certain times. Sometimes it was there really, you know, it's a quick burst of fire if you bump into the enemy. Sometimes to wake the enemy up, sometimes self-defense. But as we often go on about, that Dingo, if it's playing its key role, which is reconnaissance, yes, weaponry is important to a degree, but its most important weapon in many ways is that 19 set the radio. They're out there for gathering information, for getting that information back of what they see, what's the best way forward, how can we approach a target, etc. And yeah, you know, a fantastic British weapon of the Second World War, probably not used a vast amount on a Dingo. And you'll see that other, you know, units at certain times have taken other weapons and fitted them, Vickers K guns. Sometimes, you know, one Dingo was done up with a Beezer cannon and some other, you know, do we want to increase the firepower? I kind of think it goes against the grain of what that vehicle was really about. But obviously, again, having a little bit more oomph and meat in terms of firepower is something that if you're a soldier in a vehicle, you know, you'll see it as traditionally all through the war. People like beefing up the weaponry quite often on things, even though the CO might be saying, hang on, if it slows you down at all, you're not really getting the full benefit. So there's the Bren. Hey, Finn? Yep. Thank you.